Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Commission webinar series on the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. My name is Vanessa Cooper, and I'm the Manager of the Health and Medical Research team here at the Commission, which is the team responsible for supporting implementation of the governance framework. So before we begin today, in the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to provide an acknowledgement of country. For us at the Commission, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we meet today, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here with us today, and to the lands on which you all join us from. Before we get into day one of our webinar series and hear from our speakers, let's address some housekeeping. We have a large volume of people joining us online, so please mute your microphones and use the chat function to seek technical help or to direct questions to any of the presenters online today. And because of the high attendance, as usual, the format of these webinars will feature a closed Q&A session. This will occur on day 2. However, we still encourage you to leave any questions via the chat, and while they'll not be answered live, they will be incorporated into future resources the Commission will release, which you will see later on today during my presentation. So please leave any questions, comments, or reflections via the chat. And because evaluation and quality improvement are important to us, please take the time to complete the feedback survey that will be circulated at the end of each webinar, as this will enable the Commission to better support implementation of the governance framework across the maturity scale phase. So the duration of today will be an hour, and day 2 will be longer at an hour and a half to accommodate a Q&A session. As usual, the purpose of our webinars is to continue to educate and support health services and assessors on the governance framework and its implementation, facilitating conversations with the sector to promote the ongoing community of practice approach and to introduce new resources. Similar to our July and November webinars, this webinar series is a 2-part event, and in response to feedback received from our past webinars, we have tailored day 1 to focus on the process of assessment and available resources. So key themes about the process of assessment that you will hear repeated across the morning will be the value of health services proactively preparing for assessment to the governance framework in partnership with their procured accrediting agency, so engaging in early planning activities to identify not applicable actions, informed by the results of their self-assessment and gap analysis, which are 2 critical preparatory steps health services should already be undertaking against the safety and quality actions of the governance framework in advance of an assessment proceeding. The availability of appropriate expertise during the assessment process, both in terms of the assessors, but also the clinical trials workforce. So inviting those within the health service who are involved in the delivery of clinical trials to be actively involved in the process, to share corporate knowledge and support the overall assessment. Variations in the availability and review of evidence to support the proceedings of standard and consistent assessments. And a key theme we continue to emphasise is the need to create a culture of governance for clinical trial service delivery at senior leadership levels of the health service. And this requires their participation in the assessment process to evidence an active and continuous commitment to safety and quality standards for the clinical trials that are delivered within their organisation. In terms of resource opportunities, I'll provide an outline of the work progressed since our November webinar to support the sector with implementation of the governance framework, including the release of further fact sheets, our website update, and launch of a national assessment dashboard. First up, we'll hear from Stuart from Xavier Pacific Health, who are the clinical trials consultancy that we have been working closely with across the past 8 months to observe assessments and identify resource opportunities the Commission can progress to support a standard and consistent approach to implementing the governance framework. Stuart and his team bring strong knowledge of clinical trials and clinical governance, holding senior appointments across the health and medical research sector, and have brought this expertise together to share their findings from the observation process and an outline of the new strategies underway. We'll then move to Keith, who is an assessor with the Australian Council of Healthcare Standards, one of the accrediting agencies approved to assess the governance framework. As an experienced assessor, Keith will share his perspectives and outline expectations ahead and during assessments to establish a mutual understanding of the process among the clinical trial sector. And I will then close with a summary of resources that have been developed in response to the questions the Commission have received about implementation of the governance framework, along with processes to register for assessment. So for day 2, the theme is exemplar assessments in practice. We will feature a series of real-world case studies where model processes have been identified to facilitate a community of practice approach to implementation of the governance framework. To close day 2, we will also end with a Q&A session with presenters. And as I mentioned at the start, while you're able to leave questions via the chat function across our webinar series, these will not be answered live and will instead contribute to the development of future resources the Commission will release later in the year. So first up, we will hear from Stuart from Xavier Pacific Health to talk about their reflections from observing the assessment process. Thank you, Stuart.
Hello everyone. Today I'll be speaking about an important piece of work we have undertaken for the Commission regarding the implementation of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. But first I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as traditional owners and custodians on the lands in which we're meeting you, and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So, as many of you will already be aware, we've been engaged by the Commission following feedback from the sector on the implementation of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. And this feedback was in relation to some variation that was seen through the assessment process and outcomes. Our role was threefold. Firstly, meeting with assessors and agencies to better understand challenges and opportunities, observing the assessment process, and developing resources and quality initiative improvements. So the first part was the assessor agency meetings. What follows is really a very brief summation of what was obviously a larger piece of work. So we followed a fairly standardised approach across those meetings, but we did allow for open questions, which was actually, or open responses, which did allow for some really good feedback. So one way to illustrate the findings is through a journey map. So this shows the steps from the introduction of the framework through to assessor training and then into the process of conducting assessments. So you can see down the bottom of the screen the introduction there, the point being from assessors that the short notice assessment is a hard first step. The second point on green is that the current training resources which were prepared by the Commission were very good and were well utilised, but this has been supported by GCP training that has been conducted voluntarily by assessors, which is a great thing, by the way, to see that interest in trying to improve their knowledge. They did note that earlier training would have been helpful, and they are relying to some degree on their colleagues for support. In terms of site engagement and sampling, so some sites are not prepared or willing, and the awareness and acceptance in the sector in some parts can be low. In relation to site visits, there was a little bit of variability that was noted. So in access to PIs and the supporting information, in the approach adopted for assessment, and potentially variable interpretation of action items. So the assessors were requesting further specificity there. In terms of reporting, the evidence utilised to support findings appears variable, and the assessors noted that there were some problems with actually the Commission portal. In terms of the response, we saw evidence of competitiveness between the HSOs, so that maturity rating scale number does matter to some, and just a willingness from the assessors to improve, and we're very open to feedback from the Commission. So to summarise where they had a shared view, there were really 5 domains that were made clear. So the first one was communication, the second tools, training, reporting, and then the preparedness of the health service organisation. So communication, it could be improved through sharing lessons between agencies, consistency in messaging, more fact sheets. For tools, there was some value seen in having a standardised assessment tool. With question prompts. In regard to training, there was some interest in improving the clinical trial technical competency, which I'll describe and talk to a little bit later. Reporting further details on the maturity rating would be helpful. And just in terms of the preparation of the HSO, so having really thorough gap analyses and access to supporting documents would actually be really helpful for the process. So from there, we went on to conducting observational visits. So we've had 16 observational visits, and you can see just the variety of agencies and places in which we've conducted those. Each of those visits saw about 50 pages of notes, and there's been a report submitted for each of those observational visits too. There's some general observations. So I just thought I'd start by noting what is actually working well. So in the Commission's induction training materials, there's a section that speaks about engaging with HSO, and it notes the value of those characteristics you can see down there, and routinely all these were done well. So it was a really, a great thing to be to watch. That said, there were actually several points of variation across the process. So you can see here the points of variation, including in the health services organisation preparation for assessment, in the assessment methodology, in the questions that are asked, in the evidence that is requested, in the interpretation of the evidence, and in relating the evidence to a maturity rating. So I'm going to go through each of those now. So the first one, in the health service organisation's preparation for assessment. So HSOs were variable in their preparation, and the assessors are very dependent on the information that the health services provide. So having a really thorough gap analysis really does help the process, having access to those documents and being able to speak to people who understand, the requirements of the action will certainly, ensure the process runs well. The assessment methodology also varied quite a bit as well. So you can see to the right, there's a series of the steps that involve. So the RGO, the governing body, clinical trial assessments, evidence review, and summation. And I've provided 3 random examples. The top one shows engagement with the RGO at the outset, then the governing body, and clinical trial sampling, and then onto evidence and summation. But sometimes it can be engagement with the governing body at the outset, and you can have evidence before the clinical trial sampling. And you can see in the bottom example, you can see that there's no involvement of the governing body, and it's straight into the clinical trial sampling after the meeting with the RGO. And this does actually impact the questions that are asked as well. So, you'll always see those questions around the integration of incident, complaint, and feedback mechanisms. And the questions will often be very health service orientated and not so much on the technical side, which makes a lot of sense because it isn't really an assessment of the clinical trials per se as the integration into the system. Some assessors will work from their agency's assessment tool, but was seen to be a fair degree of variation across areas including open disclosure, medical records, First Nation peoples, and expectations around business decision making and policies and procedures. There was also variation in the evidence that's requested. So I think you'll all be aware that the framework has a description of examples of evidence, and the use of this evidence could be really strengthened. So I think routinely you'll see access to consent forms, training logs, delegation logs, not always though, but you don't regularly see access to the audit reports, incident data, and the policies and procedures. And this flows on to the interpretation of the evidence. So documents that are provided by the health service staff, such as the investigator site file, are often viewed pretty quickly and can be just through the lens of whether they're present or not. Sometimes it can be more rigorous, but it's usually assessors are under a lot of time pressure. Some assessors largely rely on verbal sources of evidence, and examples of consumer engagement in protocol development, which have been facilitated by clinical trial networks, have been mistaken for health service-led initiatives as just an example of how the evidence can be interpreted. The final point is really how this all intersects with the maturity rating scale. So just wanted to make the one point that, and this comes from the maturity rating scale fact sheet, the top area there, the accreditation assessment team reviews evidence to demonstrate that all requirements of an action are in place and integrated within the operations of the health service organisation. So, quite often you'll see that not all the requirements have been met, or alternatively, they haven't been implemented and yet an established system rating is applied. So that is certainly a point of variation. So if we flip the conversation from the assessors and actually look at their site, there were, obviously a series of, observations that related to the effective implementation of the framework. And so just a few points here. Reporting of the clinical trial performance information to the governing body, workforce, consumers and other health services is often incomplete, and you may not see the 8 indicators included. You might see 6, but you might also see the data going to the executive and not to the governing board. You may not see it going to the workforce and so on. So, but there is progress. There certainly is improvement there. The clinical trial risk management processes are often not connected to organisational risk register. So this is an area where obviously the SSA and the HREC processes will capture risk, but that is can be a fairly static process and not really integrated in the system. So certainly a bit of work there. The safe environment action item at 1.29 is often fairly light for evidence and light for evaluation too. The consumer engagement processes often require strengthening, so that 2.14 potentially requires a little bit of work. But there's been some really good examples of the work of the Research Governance Office too. I certainly, it's not across the board, but we've certainly seen some fantastic efforts work by the staff within the offices, and you can see 50-page documents with real energy behind them, and staff who are very keen to do a good job. There's also been some very strong examples of support from the governing board and governing body and the CE, and not just to the framework too. We've seen real support for clinical trials as well, which is a great outcome from the governance process, the framework. So clearly there's variation, but there are also positive signs. So we know that assessors have got a huge amount of experience in terms of the health system. So most of the assessors have worked at a high level, executive sort of role, and they have a lot of experience in assessing against the national standards. The sector and the assessors' understanding of the framework is improving as time goes on. And it's important to note that the 27 actions in the framework are actually, derived through the Standard 1 and Standard 2. So there's obviously an organisational familiarity there too. Health services are showing high levels of integration of their clinical trial service into routine health service operations. And there are signs of improvement in clinical trial service delivery, which is also a great outcome. That said, there are 4 opportunity areas. I'm trying to be brief here. And one of the important ones to note really is the scope of clinical trial services. So at this stage, it doesn't appear that there's any utilisation of the non-applicables option. So guidance is required to better support stakeholders in relation to how that might be applied. And the Commission is involved in work in that space. The clinical trial sampling process is potentially one of the greatest areas of variation. So there is uncertainty at the moment regarding the purpose of clinical trial sampling and which trials should be sampled. Assessors work with the HSO to refine the list of trials, and the time that's actually allocated can vary widely as well. The questions and the evidence provided also varies. From how's your trial going to actually let's look through the evidence. Let's actually have a close look at the trial and its integration. The standardisation of the use of the evidence base would do a world of good, I think. So, the interaction with the evidence base that's outlined in the framework can be quite light, and that would potentially standardise the assessment outcomes. I know this is widely acknowledged across the clinical trial sector, but the assessor knowledge around clinical trials is sometimes not significant, and there certainly needs to be a little bit more work there done. I mean, this is obviously accentuated by the fact you're dealing with a very knowledgeable PI and clinical trial staff, and I certainly think that there's been some impact to the lack of knowledge, and the Commission has got a prerequisite there for assessor agencies to ensure that assessors have clinical trial knowledge. So I'm sure there'll be work in this space to improve it. So with that in mind, what are the strategies to reduce the variation? So This is a quick slide to demonstrate the 3 different areas. So if you look down from 1 to 3, you can see the first part is really around the health service related assessment. So it's looking at your systems orientated assessment, so complaints, feedback, and so forth. And then the second one is around the clinical trial sampling, so the assessment of those clinical trials. And the last one is how you integrate that into your findings. So the solution is really to develop tools and checklists for each of those, and that will help to standardize and to bring a little bit more clarity around the process, and then to combine that in point 3 with ongoing training of assessors together with the conduct of webinars and the production of fact sheets. So in this slide, I just wanted to talk about the assessment process and the assessor tool guide. So obviously from the assessor's perspective, time is quite limited. So the process for getting the information and having a clear understanding of the implementation of the framework needs careful consideration. So step 1 is really the clinical trial sampling and selection, followed by a key role for the Research Governance Office, which will see information acquired under step 3, so looking at those health service systems, and then into step 4, trying to pull forward some of the information that might be required within the PI meetings. So being able to look potentially at some of the investigator site files and so forth. And then step 5 is actually the meeting with the PI. So being able to be mindful of the time. Obviously, a lot of these PIs will have clinical loads. So I know that the assessors and the HSOs are trying to balance that. So the idea being that you can be effective and efficient. So I'd just like to move on now to the summary. So there's clearly several points of variation in the assessment process have been identified, and there are a number of opportunities to support the implementation of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. Work to support the implementation is currently underway through the development of the tools and through fact sheets. And it's the use of the tools and fact sheets with training that should deliver a more consistent assessment process. So there's considerable evidence to show that the integration of clinical trials into the health service organisations is occurring, and importantly, that the quality of clinical trial service provision is improving from a position that was already widely acknowledged as globally competitive. So there's a lot to be proud of. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. It has been great to have you work with us to identify opportunities and challenges with the process of implementation and to highlight areas health services, assessors and the Commission can prioritise to support more standard and consistent assessments to the governance framework. Next up, we'll hear from Keith from ACHS to talk about the process of assessment through the lens of an assessor. Thank you, Keith.
G'day, it's Keith Love. I'm an ACHS lead assessor, and I've asked to do a presentation this morning really to outline what the National Clinical Governance Framework requirements are from an assessor's perspective. What I'll be doing today is going through the experience that I've had to outline what an assessor is looking for and the sorts of lessons that we've learnt through the introduction of the trials governance framework and what has been learned across the assessments that I've been involved with. Now, those are quite a number of assessments over the country, from small to very large clinical trials areas. And outline of the presentation today will include what the assessor's role is during the governance process and what the assessor is looking for during the assessment, the sampling of the trials to be reviewed and how the assessors and the lead assessor timetables the assessment, some misconceptions encountered during the assessments that I've been involved in, common areas of non-conformance, and learning versus passing, because some of the experience that we've had is that organisations have an expectations that they need to pass when in fact this first round is a learning experience and is meant to identify any gaps that there may be. So what's the assessor's role during the assessment process? Well, first of all, the time that's allocated will vary depending upon the size of the organisation. So an assessor may be there for 5 days, they may be there for 2 days. So they need to cram the assessment process into whatever time has been allocated for that particular assessment. They need to review the structures, the agreements, the systems, the policies and procedures for the organisations and how they relate to the requirements that are outlined in the framework. They'll assess evidence that the processes outlined are being followed, and they do that by looking at records, agendas, papers and minutes, reports, briefs, participant records and audit reports. They can see that they're accessing a lot of available evidence about what the organisation does. They'll also then note feedback from research participants, researchers, committee members, board members, executive staff, and that feedback that they derive during those interviews is used to triangulate and synthesize the information to refer back to the actions in the framework and to identify any areas where compliance is not fully complete. So you can see that the evidence used is evidence that's created by the organisation, and then that is verified in interviews with participants and researchers and committee members and board members. So it's not just a matter of looking at policies and procedures, it's really about verifying that what it says in the policies and procedures is actually what is happening. The whole assessment process is meant to inform the organisation. So the assessor's role is to brief the organisation on any findings along the way, to work with the lead assessor if the lead assessor isn't doing the assessment, and the others on the assessment team, and they agree as a team on the ratings. Then the development of the assessment report and forwarding to the accrediting organisation, and then it's forwarded back to the organisation itself. So what is an assessor looking for during the assessment? Well, the policies and procedures are reviewed to make sure that they're consistent with the requirements that are outlined in the framework. And really, the policies and procedures are the rules by which the organisation runs its organisation, and it's what the organisation says it does. What the assessor then does is triangulates that with the evidence. So going through the records, going through the interviews to confirm that the organisation is acting in accordance with its stated requirements. So is the organisation doing what it says it does? So it's triangulating what the organisation actually does with what it says it's supposed to be doing. The assessor is then looking at the governance of the organisation to make sure that it's actively involved in the development of strategy, in the monitoring of performance, and of all of the clinical trials that are proposed and underway. The assessor is also looking for the integration of systems across the organisation, and that includes how incidents are managed and whether incidents that might occur in a clinical trial are made known to the rest of the organisation and are they managed in the same way as they are managed in the rest of the organisation. How complaints are managed, and if a complaint is made for about a clinical trial participant, then does the organisation that hosts the clinical trial organisation also know about it? How risks are managed, both when a risk occurs, so retrospective, but also prospective risk management. How consumers are involved in the development of strategy and the implementation of that strategy, and how the infrastructure workplace health and safety and clinical support, supports clinical trials. When the organisation is going to be assessed, there might be hundreds, and I've been in organisations where there's been over 500 clinical trials in operation. So the Commission have established a sampling framework, and that's really mandated by the number of trials which are underway. So there's an algorithm which the assessors use to determine how many trials will be assessed as part of the assessment that's underway. The maximum is 30. So once the number of trials exceeds a certain limit, then it just becomes a ceiling of 30 trials. The organisation provides a list, and that's usually on a spreadsheet out of the trials management software that identifies the sponsor, the type of research, and whether it's sponsored commercially or it's investigator initiated. A simple random sample of the list is undertaken to extract the number of trials to be assessed, and this is then reviewed to ensure that the sample covers the main areas of interest and a cross-section of commercial and investigator-initiated trials. The opportunity presented by a research participant being available and consenting to be interviewed might actually amend a trial's inclusion because you don't know when you're not on site as to whether a participant will be available for a particular trial. Some smaller organisations have only had one trial underway. Timetabling is a function of the amount of research that's being undertaken in the organisation overall and the size of the overall assessment team. So in a very large organisation, there might be 10 or 12 assessors, and that will determine whether there's a specific assessor that's just looking at the clinical trials governance framework or whether it's broken up across a number of assessors who are looking at particular aspects of the standards. A single assessor may be allocated to clinical trials, or the framework actions may be allocated across several assessors. Some larger health services districts are moving towards a whole of organisational approach to the framework assessment rather than facility by facility. And as experience rolls out in terms of assessing against the framework, it's becoming more and more common that the larger organisations are moving towards this whole of organisation approach. Now, there are some misconceptions that we've encountered during this first year of the rollout of the framework. And the first is really that the first assessment is a pass or fail process. And if we get an overall rating of less than 3, we've failed in some way as an organisation. That the assessment is a review of the technical clinical quality of the research activity, and this has really been quite common. It is the view of some of the people that we're been assessing is that we're actually looking into the research itself to determine whether that research is something that they should be involved with, and that we're looking at the technical or clinical value of that research. That's not the case. The assessors are simply looking at whether the research activity is being conducted according to the requirements of the framework. It's also been a misconception that the assessors need to be research experts to review compliance with the framework. Really, the assessors are experts in assessing whether organisations are meeting the requirements outlined in the actions which are in the framework. They don't necessarily have to be research experts, but they will be a senior person from the healthcare system who has been involved in research either directly or indirectly through their career. There are individuals who have a background in research and are assessors, and often they'll be the person selected by the lead assessor to do the assessment. But it's certainly not necessary for the assessor to be an expert in research to determine whether the organisation is meeting the requirements of the actions. There's also been a misconception that the assessors can't review confidential information, and the assessment organisations have a relationship with each of the organisations that they're assessing to ensure that confidential information is available and is treated appropriately. So all of the assessors in an assessment team will, if the organisation requires it, sign confidentiality agreements the same as if they were employed or contracted to that organisation. There's a misconception that the organisation selects the trials for review and can deny access to other trial files due to confidentiality or sensitivity of the research topic, or that somehow the assessors might take information out of those sensitive research activities and somehow share that with other organisations. Again, the assessors sign confidentiality agreements with their assessor organisation, and if they're required to, they'll sign one specifically with the organisation they're assessing if that's required. So that shouldn't be really something that the organisations being assessed need to be concerned about. What it does do, though, is if the assessors are denied access to particular research trials or the files relating to a particular research trial, it raises suspicion in the assessor that the organisation is somehow trying to hide something from the assessment team. So using a simple random sample and making sure that that's stratified so that it meets all the requirements for cutting across the research areas and across sponsored and research-initiated trials, then those are the trials that should be used for the assessment and not translated or others used in their stead. It's also the case that the assessment is not necessarily going to get to all researchers. If you've got 500 trials underway, then all the researchers aren't going to be interviewed. It is a sampling process and the maximum is 30. If you've got a very large organisation that's got a number of different research areas, then not every area might be visited during the assessment. It's really a function of the size and the time available. There may be a misconception that the assessors are trying to trap the organisation and they're asking questions of researchers and research participants to try and get information out of them which is going to make them fail. Really, when the assessors are asking questions, they're simply trying to ascertain how the research organisation works, and they're trying, as they ask those questions, to triangulate the information that they've already gained through the review of the policies and procedures and guidelines and minutes and so on. So there's no traps. It's really about asking questions so the assessor can make an assessment with information that's provided by the people working in the organisation. A lot of organisations have engaged private consultants to undertake an external review against the framework, and there might be a misconception that the person who did that was an expert in the application of the framework. Well, in this first round, in this first year, there are no experts in the application of the framework, and consultants engaged have sometimes overstated the readiness, and that hasn't been a positive thing for the organisation because they've had to go back and pick up the pieces once the actual assessment's gone through and might have said something quite different than the consultant did in their initial review. So that's been the experience, that often consultant reviews that have been independently undertaken have overstated the level of readiness and might have been an impediment rather than a lever to assist progress. Consultants are very reluctant sometimes to provide a negative report because they want to be consulted again. Some common areas of non-conformance, and this is my sample, the Commission would have a lot more evidence that's been built up in this first round. But often we see a lack of clear evidence that the governing body is involved in strategic planning of it and monitoring of the KPIs related to research activity. If there has been any involvement, then it's been very slim. And the number of KPIs that have been collected and used have also not covered all of the KPIs that are mandated in the trials governance framework. There's been a poor integration of the research and organisational systems, for example, consumer involvement, complaint, incident and risk management, where the trials have kept their own records and handled their own complaints and incidents. They've had their own risk register, but it hasn't been integrated with the overall governance systems of the organisation. We've seen a low involvement of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in the planning for and participation in trials. And some organisational research systems have been unable to identify whether a trial participant actually identified as an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander person because the system didn't enable the capture of that data. So if you can't capture that data, then it's very difficult to do an analysis of what the involvement is for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. A lot of the organisations are now amending those systems to enable them to capture that information and report on it. We've also seen equipment and medications being managed in the research environment without the oversight by the relevant areas of the wider organisation. And that's one of the reasons why the framework was developed and implemented. So the fact that we're seeing those things probably is some evaluation of the fact that the governance framework is picking up things it was intended to pick up. We've also seen partnership agreements with external partner organisations like universities and other research bodies, which don't reflect the current organisational arrangements. A lot of the ones we've seen are long-standing and don't mention the requirements in the framework and don't have direct line of sight for monitoring by the governing body. So a lot of the research partnership agreements, which research parts of an organisation have, both with the wider governing organisation and with other partner organisations, tend to be redundant or out of date and need to be revised to reflect the requirements in the framework and need to be endorsed by the governing body. We've also seen that there's a concern about reputation in not passing the first round. So there is variation in organisations and how they receive the findings. Some are really open to knowing where the gaps are because they really want to address those to ensure that when they are assessed properly, where it will be a pass-fail situation, that they're well prepared for that. Now, when the findings are presented, they should be factual and relate to specific evidence found during the assessment. And that's why the briefing with the executive each day is important, because at the end of the assessment, the organisation should have no surprises about what's going to be in the final report. Now, the ratings are somewhat subjective, but there are word pictures in the framework and in the national standards actions to assist in that subjective rating. And to overcome that subjectivity, the whole team that are there in the assessment, they present the findings to the team, and then the whole team makes an assessment about the ratings. It's not a single individual. It's not the assessor who's assessing the trials governance framework. It's not the lead assessor. It's the whole team. The team also need to put enough information into the report to justify the rating that they've provided. Now, in the first round, overstating the rating is not in the organisation's best interest, because if it's overstated, then the organisation won't know fully the gaps that they need to address, and they won't put the priority action that's required to address those gaps. Now, having a good reputation in the research community doesn't necessarily mean that the organisation fully meets the requirements of the framework. There may be long-standing gaps and sometimes feuds between research areas and the parent host organisation. And those long-standing gaps and feuds may impact on the capacity of the organisation to fully meet the requirements of the framework. Now, that's not to say that the research going on in that organisation is not good research that's providing good evidence to the health community. It really just means that those long-standing gaps and feuds have been pasted over or worked around, and the assessment may assist to reduce some of those. Now, that's my presentation on the experience that I've had over the assessment of a number of organisations, research organisations, big and small, across Australia. And I hope that the information I've provided today actually provides some good information that the people participating in the webinar today can develop questions about. And I hope that it really allows people to move a little bit further forward in their journey to make the clinical trials governance framework work in their organisation. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. I note you also shared a similar presentation at the ACTA Symposium in December, which was well received. And for the clinical trials sector, we do acknowledge that accreditation is a new concept, but hearing about the process of assessment and general expectations is reassuring. And we would emphasise that the clinical trials workforce need to identify and engage early with their safety and quality teams who are already well established within the health service and experienced in the process of assessment to support the development of plans ahead of short notice. Now, I will share a brief summary of the resources underway by the Commission to support implementation of the governance framework. Across the maturity scale period, the Commission are committed to supporting health services and assessor agencies with implementation of the governance framework. And we've undertaken this through the release of webinars such as these, with case studies of exemplar practices, a survey, meeting with health service organisations, and publishing fact sheets, advisories, and responses to frequently asked questions. Our recent updates include a fact sheet on incident management to support the sector meet the requirements of Action 1.11 of the governance framework, and an outline toward the intent of this action was provided in our November webinar series. We have also held periodic webinars across 2024 in July and November, which are available on our YouTube site, also accessible via our website or via the QR code on the screen. And today we will outline the fact sheets that have been developed and revised to address key themes and topics that have emerged from the sector, which will also be shared via our revised health and medical research website. Earlier today, you heard from Stuart, who we've been working closely with to educate and support the assessor workforce, and we're in the process of developing practical tools to be utilised during assessments to guide a more standard and consistent process. We are also progressing internal plans to optimise the current orientation for assessors course and clinical trials portal, and hopefully we can share these updates with you at our next webinar. And lastly, we've been working on the release of a national dashboard, which will aggregate registration and assessment outcomes data, accompanied by information from a lessons learnt across the process of the assessment to the governance framework under the maturity scale, along with a feedback survey. So the first new fact sheet we have developed is focused on implementing the governance framework and preparing to undergo assessment. Its intent is to provide clarity for health service organisations and accrediting agencies to logically prepare for assessment by stepping out the various processes required. The key message is that a multidisciplinary approach at both operational and leadership levels of the health service is needed to build in-depth corporate knowledge of the governance framework and process of assessment to the National Safety and Quality Health Service standards, establish strategic and cultural leadership to drive improvements for clinical trial service provision, conduct periodic self-assessments and gap analysis to identify areas where the health service meets applicable actions of the governance framework and areas where improvement is required, establishing action plans and reporting this information through the health service's governance structure. This includes identifying and documenting clear roles and responsibilities of the clinical trial workforce, along with the need to implement reliable processes for clinical trials that focus on adopting and adapting the organisation's existing clinical and corporate systems, along with the processes for quality improvement and evaluation. And finally, engaging consumers in the design, monitoring, performance, measurement, quality improvement, and governance of the clinical trial service. And each step is accompanied by key resources and general advice to support the sector meet each component of the process. The second new fact sheet we have developed is focused on defining the scope of assessment. Its intent is to provide clarity for health service organisations and accrediting agencies on the criteria for assessment. Key messages include a requirement for health services that undergo assessment to the NSQHS standards and that provide a clinical trial service to be assessed to applicable actions of the governance framework, which reflect their own level of service delivery. The concept of own level of service delivery is an important point, and it recognises that the service context in which clinical trials are delivered varies widely, and that health service organisations engage in different aspects of a clinical trial, ranging from full delivery to partial or service provider arrangements. And the role of the health service in relation to the clinical trial and associated activities should determine the scope of the assessment. So to assist with this, clinical trial sites should complete a gap analysis or self-assessment against all actions of the governance framework. This information will inform the areas where further work is required to meet the standards and actions that are not applicable to the service at the time of assessment and are therefore not to be assessed during the current cycle. It will also identify key roles and responsibilities across the organisation, and the Commission are in the process of releasing further guidance on the process of not applicables. Results of the gap analysis will also help to inform where sites should adopt or adapt clinical governance systems and processes of the health service organisation, along with those related to partnering with consumers, to ensure they meet the local needs, values, and that they are appropriate in the context in which the service operates. It also defines the type of clinical trials to be sampled, outlining those that are in and out of scope. So, for example, only active clinical trials are to be assessed. This includes those trials in which recruitment has closed and patients are still receiving treatment, as they remain a patient of the health service for ongoing care, which can span several months or years and does present safety and quality considerations for the health service organisation to manage. While projects that utilise retrospective data collected from a clinical trial and stored in an enduring registry are not within the scope of a clinical trial and should not be selected for sampling. The same applies for any prospective registries for randomised clinical trials. Along with the release of 2 new fact sheets, we have also updated 3 existing fact sheets. They include the process of assessment, maturity scale, and sampling. The changes to the process of assessment fact sheet are intended to provide clarification to health services on accreditation cycles and registering for assessment to the governance framework. Key messages include the safety and quality standards of the governance framework align to the NSQHS standards and are being implemented as an embedded approach under the Australian Health Service Safety and Quality Accreditation Scheme, which is a scheme the Commission operates. It is the role of jurisdictions to register their health service that provides a clinical trial service for assessment to the governance framework. The governing body should establish a culture of governance for clinical trials that proactively engages the clinical trial workforce in partnership with safety and quality teams to prepare plans for assessment. And as clinical trial services are a new service type undergoing accreditation, health services will be assessed to applicable actions in the governance framework for clinical trial service provision at least once during their own accreditation cycle against a maturity scale. Beyond the initial accreditation cycle, the time at which a health service transitions to full assessment of their clinical trial service under the ASQA scheme is being reviewed by the Commission, with advice to be released to the sector shortly. And this means that despite the governance framework launching in May of 2023, alongside the process of short notice commencing in July 2023, timings as to when an assessment to the governance framework will occur remains variable across health services and is dependent upon their own cycles. And further information can be provided by the safety and quality team embedded within the health service and who are responsible for the coordination of the accreditation process. The revised fact sheet also groups the accreditation cycles into distinct functions and outlines the expectations of each to assist health services prepare and understand the assessment process. So alongside the revision to the process of assessment fact sheet, we are also in the process of updating guidance related to the maturity scale and sampling. For the maturity scale, updates relate to the rating scale to be applied at the second cycle of a health services assessment to the governance framework. And for sampling, the intent is to provide greater guidance to assessor agencies toward the methodology to be applied, accompanied by a new guidance tool to support a more structured and consistent process. And we will share the outcome of these updates with you in our next webinar series or launch them via an EDM release. So the Commission is also progressing a broader digital transformation project to increase the accessibility of its website and online assets. And to align with the objective of this project, we have also updated existing web pages that support implementation of the governance framework to ensure information remains accessible and user-friendly, aligns with content already available under the NSQHS standards for consistency, and that updates are shared in a timely and succinct manner via new notification banners to communicate key updates to the sector as they emerge. And our final update is in relation to the release of a new dashboard for the governance framework, and it will replicate a similar format to the National General Practice Accreditation Scheme, which is operated by the Commission. And its purpose is to provide an indicator to the sector on the process of implementation, including an aggregation of assessment outcomes data against the maturity scale, along with a number of health services that have been registered by their jurisdiction for assessment of their clinical trial service. The webpage where the dashboard is hosted will include a section on lessons learnt that will feature responses in relation to key issues and access to a feedback survey to help the Commission identify opportunities for future resource development. So what is next across the rest of the year? Well, priority areas for the Commission include the launch of a new assessment tool for assessors to ensure standard and consistent assessments to the governance framework, and a pilot on the utility of the tool is currently underway. We are also updating the fact sheet on the maturity scale and the process of sampling, as I mentioned, to provide clarity to the sector on next steps regarding the rating scale to be applied during a second assessment to the governance framework and expectations related to sampling. We're also looking at progressing a new fact sheet on decentralised clinical trial models and the processes of assessment, focusing on teletrials and satellite sites. As you will hear in day 2 of our webinar series tomorrow, we've commenced discussions with the Australian Teletrials Program to understand opportunities and challenges related to implementation of the governance framework and how the Commission can respond to support equity of access for clinical trial service provision. We have also in the process of refreshing our clinical trials portal to better support the process of self-assessment and evidence gathering against applicable actions, together with releasing a fact sheet on not applicable actions and a survey to inform future resource opportunities. So this brings us to the end of day one for our April webinar series. Thank you to everyone who has joined online and to our speakers Stuart and Keith for generously donating their time this morning to share their reflections with you all. As I mentioned, these webinars are being recorded and will be published on our website. An EDM will also be released shortly to advise when these videos are available. We look forward to seeing you back online for day 2 tomorrow afternoon to hear from our case studies and facilitate a Q&A session. Thank you, everyone.